Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on looks like it's going to be a great weekend, finally. And maybe fiscal policy would be a more appropriate name these days as the legislature tries to grapple with the choices that need to be made. As many of you know, you've listened in on the previous speakers we've had who've talked about their various proposals regarding how to bring some stability and predictability, more or less, to our state's finances. Today, we're really pleased that Senator von Imhof could join us as a member of the Senate and the Senate Finance Committee. We look forward to hearing her proposal because it does take kind of a different approach to the permanent fund and the dividend issue. And so we're really interested in hearing more about it. And so with that, Senator, this is your second term, as I recall, right? And we appreciate your willingness to serve the people of Alaska in the legislature, because we know it can't be an easy job or an easy time to do this. So the choice and your willingness is really appreciated. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Juanetta for her expert MC ability. And we look forward to hearing from you, Senator. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Cheryl. Senator, do you want me to run the slide deck for you, or yes? Okay.
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, let me bring that up.
So while you're bringing that up, I'll just say thank you, everyone, for being online today and watching this presentation. I really appreciate it. This should be a kickoff of a pretty darn good weekend. I think it's going to be one of the nicest weekends that we're going to experience this summer. It's going to be the Alaskan heat wave. So thank you very much for starting your weekend here. And so today I am presenting an idea about how to solve the permanent fund dividend calculation. Ever since I've been in the legislature for the last 5 years, it has definitely dominated the conversation. And it's only less than a quarter of our budget, but it takes about 80% of our time. And I think we call that Prater's Law. 20% of your something takes 80% of your time, and that's basically what's happening. Essentially, so Juanita, are you going to get the presentation going?
Yeah, hang on just 1 second.
Okay.
It was not where I was expecting it, so.
Okay. Well, I'll just keep going. Essentially, my second slide there says that the dividend has in essence paralyzed the legislature, and it really has, because most of the time and energy that we spend on the discussion is how much should the dividend be each year and how should we pay for it? It is crippling us financially, and we are in the last few years liquidating each of our savings accounts slowly but surely. It's also creating deep philosophical fissures within the legislature itself, and of course within the citizens. There are folks both in Juneau as well as statewide that say, please prioritize the dividend over and above everything else. Cut the budget to pay the dividend. And so as a result, we're not necessarily investing in our state like we should be. There's folks that say we are a wealth ownership state. It's our oil, it's our wealth, it's our asset. And I agree, but I also think that comes with assets also comes with liabilities. Okay, so let's do the second slide. Thank you, Juanita. So with our assets also come comes liabilities, and I think that sometimes we don't always remember that. One of the things that I really want to remind folks is that a $500 check actually costs the state $325 million. So a $1,000 check is $650 million, and so forth. And so to put things in perspective, in many years, the state has paid less than $200 million in general funds towards the capital budget. So the question remains, and this is what I ask people, and I put this in quotes, what is the better investment? Is it $325 million in the form of a $500 check to every citizen to help with rent, food, utilities, healthcare, debt payments, credit card payments, school clothes, furniture, car payments, education costs, etc.? Or should the state spend $325 million to invest in projects that create year-round jobs that support families, building roads to connect communities so people can visit health clinics, airports, and visit each other, as well as building roads to access resources to attract and expand business investment, as well as deferred maintenance to repair bridges, schools, replace equipment, etc. In the last several years, we've paid about $1,000 or even $1,500 dividends each year. So what has that gotten us? So next slide. What's that gotten us? Or I hate to say that. Where that has landed us, that Alaska is, I think what it says, in hardcore survival mode and America's worst state for business in 2021. We're the 50th, we're last. Our grades for business, worst state to do business, we have D's and F's with all of that. That just came out this week. So next slide. We are second to last for the 10 worst states for infrastructure. We don't, our capital budgets have been anemic. We don't provide or prioritize deferred maintenance. We don't prioritize attracting new business investment. Instead, we've been slowly liquidating each of our savings accounts each year to pay millions, if not billions, towards a dividend. The irony is that we are one of the richest states in the union, but we have poor spending habits. So, next slide. So the three big decision points. Every year the state puts together a budget to pay for all of state government, including agency, capital funding, debt, retirement, and since 1982, we've funded the dividend has been included as a budget item. So currently the dividend is in statute and had been untouched for 33 years. Then starting in 2016, under the Bill Walker administration, the statute was ignored for the first time when the governor set the dividend amount arbitrarily at $1,000 per person. This prompted a lawsuit filed by Senator Wielechowski against the state of Alaska that questioned whether or not the 1976 amendment to the Alaska Constitution exempted the legislature's use of the permanent fund income from the Constitution's anti-dedication clause. The Supreme Court ruling in the Wielechowski versus Alaska case, which came upon August 25th in 2017, stated that the legislature's use of the permanent fund income is subject to normal appropriation and veto budgetary process. Thus, the legislature can follow the statute or not. The legislature is the appropriating body and can choose to fund or not fund any particular program, department, etc. So in principle, I am very much against putting any fiscal or economic policy into the Constitution. You don't put the education formula in the Constitution or the Medicaid formula or any guaranteed dollar payments for any department into the Constitution, because this can fiscally devastate the state in the event of an economic downturn. However, I agree with the governor that this issue needs to be solved and we must stabilize and protect our financial health. But in order to reach a compromise for this very unique problem, I'm proposing a unique solution, which I will outline in the next few slides. But the second issue that I look at is the question, do we institute a personal taxes on every citizen in order to pay a dividend? So I have stated this before. Why would we tax the wages of one person only to deposit their money into the personal checking account of their neighbor? That doesn't make sense to me. And why would we remove millions of dollars from the economy that could be used to build infrastructure and instead provide it as a consumer payout where the first 24% goes to the federal government anyway in the form of federal income taxes? And then, do we promote an ad hoc draw on the permanent fund on each year to pay for a dividend? If we draw more than 5% each year from the fund, we seriously risk shrinking the fund. We basically destroy our nest egg. Decades of history of endowments, foundations, and sovereign wealth funds all around the world show that any draw over 5% erodes the fund's value over time. The global markets can't support it. So all that being said, I do support a dividend for the future. The dividend is part of the culture and history of our state, and many people depend on it. But I believe that we must solve the dividend calculation into something that is affordable and sustainable over time, so we can finally put it behind us and take steps forward to rebuild and reimagine our future. I mean, that's what I ran to be a state senator, is to talk about education and economic opportunity. And that's where I'd like to be. So slide 6, please. So here are some of the rough numbers. So this is the budget for the governor's FY22, and we're looking at unrestricted general funds. And I'm using the governor's proposed budget because it was unencumbered with COVID relief funds, which came later in the session and really muddied the waters a bit. As you can see, we have a surplus before paying a dividend. So we do have enough to cover our expenses. And of course, this was the spring revenue forecast when oil was going up. What this means is essentially any dividend or any large expenditure beyond this will require taxes, or a continued liquidation of the CBR, a constitutional budget reserve, or an ad hoc draw on the permanent fund. Slide 7, please. So looking at some of the comparisons of different proposals, I know that there's a plan that's advocating for about $1,000 dividend, such as the 80-20 split, or using other calculation mechanisms, or the governor's 50-50 proposal on the far right-hand side. All of these produce significant deficits that will require taxes or an ad hoc draw. And in regards to taxes, because of our small population, and that less than half of our population is employed, it will take both an income tax and a sales tax to close the gap, definitely for the governor's plan. Everyone will be paying taxes in order to receive a dividend. So next slide, please. So the guiding principles going into my proposal is that I do not want to tax citizens to pay a dividend. I do not want to require annual ad hoc draws from the permanent fund to pay a dividend. I do not want to liquidate our savings accounts to pay a dividend. I want to make sure that there is a dividend for future generations. I'd like a solution that's easy to understand, and finally allows the legislature to focus on other things and stabilizes the financial future of the state. So these are the things that I thought of as when I came up with this idea. So next slide, please. So I propose that we create a new constitutionally protected, solely dedicated dividend fund. It will pay out 5% of its earnings each year just for a dividend. This will ensure that our children and grandchildren will receive a dividend well into the future. And I call this the Alaska Resource Ownership Revenue Account, or Aurora for short. And I did drop a bill, SR18, that's in Senate right now. So the details include, and I'll show a diagram of it in the next slide, but the details include that we move $6.7 billion from the traditional permanent fund to create this Aurora dividend account. The $6.7 billion amount is based on the unpaid permanent fund dividends between 2016 and 2023. And I had to make some assumptions about this year's and next year's dividend. And 2023, because that's going to be after the next election when we have to vote on something like this. It does split the current oil royalties going into the traditional account by 50-50 with this new Aurora account, meaning of the 25% of the royalties that are currently deposited into the current permanent fund now, 12.5% will go into the traditional permanent fund, and 12.5% will go into the new Aurora dividend account. This way, there'll be principal deposits into both accounts each year. This action then creates a unique dividend fund that is entirely separate from the traditional permanent fund that will remain to pay for government. And since the Aurora account will be in the Constitution, this guarantees a dividend, and the dividend will be untouchable and protected. The fund will grow over time. It will be invested alongside with the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation, and a 5% draw of each year will fund the dividend. Next slide, please. So what this looks like, let me pull up my slide deck here, is we will take $6.7 billion from the permanent fund And this is, okay, so this is the value as of 5/31. I didn't have 6/30, they didn't have it out yet. So this is 5/31, but I did incorporate the 4 billion that the governor did not veto that will move from the earnings reserve into the principal. So these are those adjusted numbers. And so what we're gonna do is transfer 6.7 billion and create this new revenue account. So next slide, please. So SJR 18 is exactly the same as the governor's proposal in that I support that we turn the permanent fund, the traditional permanent fund, into a true endowment by folding the earnings reserve account into the principal to become one account, and that we put 5% of the market value into the Constitution. So we never take more than 5%. And then I changed that 12.5% of the royalties will be deposited into the fund. Again, splitting 50-50, the 25% of the royalties between the two. Slide, the next slide, please. So the results are, we have two separate funds. The traditional endowment, which will have an ending balance of 73 billion. One funds government and the other funds the dividend. Both will be in the Constitution. Both will be a true endowment. Both will have a 5% draw maximum. Both will have 12.5% of the royalties, so they can grow over time. One will fund government, one will fund the dividend. Next slide, please. So this is ledge finance. It models the revenue from our different sources. So normal and annual revenue is in blue in the bottom. The annual POMV revenue from the traditional permanent fund will be in green. And the new annual revenue from the Aurora account is in purple. The good news is the black dotted line is the budget, including the dividend, which we see as balanced for the foreseeable future. There's no draws on the CBR, which is the orange bar, so that account can grow over time. There's no big red bars or deficits, which means taxes or ad hoc draws. The Aurora account is expected to grow at about 6.2% each year. The operating budget is assumed to grow by inflation of about 2% each year, whereas, on a sidebar, the governor's plan does require tens of millions of dollars of cuts each year to keep the deficits from growing too large. And what I'm showing here has been stress tested, meaning this applies to both market upswings and downswings. And I use the 2009 to 2017, one of the worst investment periods in our state, and it still works. Next slide, please. So this shows, and just focus on the left side that has the green and blue bars. This is a legislative graph that shows that $1,000 PFD does require taxes or ad hoc draws. This is the red bar. No matter how much fancy calculations might be with various different plans, and I've heard several, the bottom line is that it's always about cash flow. If you take 650 million from the economy and put it towards a dividend, it always creates deficits. We can't afford it unless we have some sort of new revenue. And then again, it's just merely a policy choice whether we want to take 650 million that has potential to purchase or build assets, expand and attract wealth into the state versus a consumer spending. Both have merit. It's just a policy choice. Then the next slide, please. Now this is the governor's 50-50 plan. You see a lot of red. Each of these bars represents well over $1 billion of deficits each year. And this will require a hefty taxes to pay for this or ad hoc draws. Personally, I think it's bad policy to keep drawing more and more money from the earnings reserve account each year because you liquidate the permanent fund. So I just started calling it, well, why don't we just call it the temporary fund, because pretty soon it's going to be gone. Okay, number 16, please. By carving out a portion of the traditional permanent fund and creating a separate dedicated dividend fund, it is a compromise solution that factors into several perspectives into one single plan. When it's in the Constitution, you can't override a statute. There's no personal taxes in order to pay a dividend. If we do pass personal taxes for any reason, it will be on the traditional side and it will be used to fund government, deferred maintenance, infrastructure, debt payments, whatever it may be. Models show that this is a sustainable plan even during volatile market cycles. This does require a vote of the people. We would have to pass something this spring out of the legislature and put it on the ballot for 2022. This is important to the governor and others. The dividend will no longer compete with government spending, so we can stop arguing about it. I think it's simple to understand. I like that we share the wealth 50-50 with the government through the royalty split. It does require continued downward pressure on the government, because by taking $6.7 billion from the traditional permanent fund, there will be a smaller POMV, which is less revenue to spend. Of course, it depends on the market returns. Revenue does grow slowly, and oftentimes expenses outpace revenue, especially in things like healthcare, price of fuel, and construction costs like the price of lumber. We're seeing inflation now. So we must continue to find efficiencies. Ideally, a spending cap will also help keep legislative spending in check. And I've carried both a spending bill. I have carried a spending bill the last 5 years, and I'd like to see both the Aurora account and the spending cap bill be part of the final solution. And then last slide here. I like that it's a completely hands-off solution. You set it up and then you let it grow. And the legislature can focus on other things. We don't have to talk about it anymore. It will improve our efficiency and productivity so much in the legislature. I like that there's no individual taxes required to pay a dividend under the Aurora plan. I'd rather use Wall Street money to pay for government than your money. And it does stabilize the financial future of our state. And then this last slide is a comic, and I'll give you guys a chance to, hopefully you can read it on your screen. Mine's a split screen and I can't see it, but I saw this just a few days ago and it seemed pretty apropos. So that was my presentation, and certainly open for questions.
Great. Thank you, Senator von Imhof. So once again, for our participants online, you can submit your questions through the chat at any time. We do have a few questions that have already been submitted. Cheryl, did you want to open up with any questions?
Sure. Thanks, Juanette. And thank you, Senator, for a different approach. And I think it's welcomed, frankly. That's my personal opinion. So let's say we had the Aurora plan. I don't see where then you still have your investment in infrastructure. There's no increased or additional investment. Was there? I could have missed it.
No, what I basically stated was you're going to just split out the two plans, so you have two funds. And then once the dust settles, the legislature and the administration can decide how they want to increase revenue on the traditional fund side for government, whether it be for infrastructure and so forth. But I don't feel comfortable personally increasing revenue at this juncture, because in my previous talks I've given is I asked the question, if the state gets new cash at this time, when I say cash, and it can be in the form of that we cut a bunch of services and programs and we free up cash, like the governor did with his vetoes. Oil prices spike, which they have, they're in the 70s. We institute taxes of some sort, or we have savings accounts. So if we have new cash, how should the state spend it? Well, right now, I believe I'm going to Juneau in August, and there's going to be folks that want to spend all this new cash into just a dividend, nothing for infrastructure. Because a lot of folks are hoping that the Biden administration will have a big infrastructure plan, but we can't, count on that. So to me, Cheryl, it's more important to solve the dividend. And of course, the Aurora plan, one of the downfalls is that it's a smaller dividend. It resets the dividend to be about $500. That is true. But it will grow over time. And I'm trading the smaller amount for some folks' comfort level with it's going to grow over time and it's in the Constitution. And it's a policy choice. But I think that $500 in people's pockets and then spending the second $325 million into projects that create year-round jobs and attract new investment to the state, bridges, the port, trams, trails, hut to hut, you name it.
Yeah. Well, what about, is there any interest in doing general obligation bonds? Switching gears a bit, but in terms of with a focus on or priority of infrastructure, I mean, that is a traditional financing mechanism for governments.
We talked about that, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But, you know, if we're paying an extra 25 million, we get a $250, $300 million bond. Our debt service pays another 25 million. And it's not, yeah, we can afford that. But again, what we're doing is, I don't think that's fiscal policy. We're borrowing to, and I remember talking to, you know, some debt folks about this. We're borrowing money for infrastructure when the cash, we have cash, we don't want to use it. We want to give it away. We want to liquidate it. I think that Equifax and rating companies, Moody, well, not Equifax, but Moody's and so forth, they're going to look at us and be like, you have cash. Why would you borrow money and keep your cash and invest it? Don't liquidate it. And so there's cash flow problems with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, Senator, we do have some questions from the audience, and I think you've addressed this, but maybe you want to speak to it a little bit more in depth. I mean, obviously, the question that the general public will have is, what kind of dividend can I count on into the future? And obviously, that's going to be, you've sort of pegged that at about $500 a year, but what's your anticipation moving forward? What could voters and potential dividend recipients anticipate longer term in terms of dividends?
Well, if we have 12.5% of the royalties going into the fund each year, and if oil stays high and we have more productivity and more production, that dividend will go up a lot faster. So that does align. I like that it finally aligns directly. The more oil productivity we have, the more natural resources productivity we have, natural gas, we're going to get a bigger dividend faster. But I think it's going to grow over time based on the market values and the market returns, just like the regular permanent fund.
All right. Can you speak procedurally to what's the likelihood of success moving forward? We heard from Representative Wool last week that with this bicameral fiscal policy working group that maybe he didn't want to necessarily handicap that there's going to be a successful proposal coming forward. We have a special session coming up to address some of the constitutional amendments that the governor has proposed. How are all of these things going to fall into line, either up or down in terms of proposals and moving forward perhaps with a vote of the people on some measure?
So I think I can feel more comfortable talking about the process versus the outcome or likeliness of outcome. The likeliness of outcome is anybody's guess. It will require hours of conversations, public conversations, public dialogue, committee conversations, and so forth. And the likelihood of that is anybody's guess. I believe that there's the legislature will be meeting, whether it be August 2nd or sometime in August. We may meet again in October. I suspect that we may not get our work done in August, that we'll probably meet again, and we'll continue these conversations. SR18 is in play. It is a bill. I'm hoping that it will begin to be heard, both on the Senate side and the various different committees, and that now my understanding, and I think there's people that know this better online right now, that know this better than I, but I believe there needs to be a 2/3 vote by both bodies in order to put something on the on the election. And I think that has to happen within 120 days before the election there. And I apologize that I've not actually looked into the exact fine tune and have those dates, but I will. I just don't have them right now, but I will. But I know that, let's just say next session, there needs to be a plan, whether it's Aurora or somebody else, if we want to put it in the Constitution, so it can go on the ballot in the fall. If it's just a statute change, then that can happen at any point before we sign or die.
Okay. Can you give us any insights into what you're hearing from your colleagues about the potential for a future constitutional convention to look at some of these issues, perhaps, and maybe redesign both the dividend and the scope of state government?
Well, a constitutional convention is different than a constitutional amendment. And I think that there is heartburn on all sides of the issue and hope on all sides of the issue. There are folks that would like a full-blown constitutional convention because they would like to make many, many changes. There are folks that are very wary and hesitant of something like that, and would simply like to make a constitutional amendment. If anything, the traditional endowment and just folding the earnings reserve account into the corpus. If anything, just putting the 5% draw into the Constitution through an amendment, and that's it. Then we fund government with a 5% draw out of the traditional fund, and that's it. And if that's all, and I don't want to say if that's all we get, if that's the process that we make or the progress, I consider that a gigantic win, and I will be ecstatic if that what comes to fruition. And that doesn't require a constitutional convention. That's just an amendment.
Great. Thank you. We have a couple of questions that have just come in that kind of speak to the philosophy about paying a dividend while taxing individuals. And, you know, I mean, it's problematic for, let me see, sorry, I've got a couple of things popping around here. It's a little bit problematic when considering, you know, even in the long term. Let's say that the Aurora proposal moves forward, and that you spoke to the fact about carrying a spending cap bill over the years, and even though we've had one that has not been sort of functional or successful in many respects, in the long term, the possibility for taxation still exists if we're not successful in controlling state government. So under those circumstances, in fact, we would be paying a dividend and taxing. Can you speak to that at any level?
Yeah. I mean, I understand. Are we splitting hairs? Sure. Are we, as long as we're paying a dividend in some form or fashion, whether it's its own account and it's a Aurora account and it's being funded by its own special account, and we're collecting taxes of some form or fashion over here. Oh, don't look over here. Only look. I mean, yeah, we are doing both. We are, and I fully acknowledge that. But what is happening now is that each new amount of money that we have, there's a grab to make a bigger and bigger dividend. And so once the dividend calculation is solved in any form or fashion, and I argued that if it's in statute, it has been and will, I think, will continue to be ignored. Once it's solved, ideally in the Constitution, and I say ideally with, you know, putting my palm of my head against my skull here, but once it's solved, then any new revenue that we get, yes, we're still paying a dividend over here. Yes, I acknowledge that. Yes, it's kind of oxymoronic, but it is what it is. The revenue that we have here that we start collecting, we can actually safely and confidently spend it on other things and not a dividend, because the dividend's been solved and then the revenues have matched the dividend over here. They're perfectly matched. Over here, whatever new revenue we get, we can put towards infrastructure or deferred maintenance or whatever it is we want to spend. So sure, full disclosure, you're right.
Well, you know, I'm reminded of some of the statements that Governor Hammond made in the sort of the run up to the dividend, that the dividend would make Alaskans pay more attention to state government. And it seems like the reverse is the case when you don't necessarily have a stake in what's happening within government, but you're waiting for a check, and that is an automatic, it essentially has been an automatic process for 35 or 40 years. But now people are just more engaged in the discussion about where's the check, as opposed to how effective and efficient is my government. And so it does seem like bifurcating the question could I mean, it is bifurcated, but really structurally within the Constitution would perhaps bring people's attention back to how effective and efficient is my government. One of the things that I think has confounded Alaskans quite a bit, certainly in the last few years, is the procedural votes that are required to bring the budget in over the finish line. And certainly the sweep and reverse sweep procedures are a little bit confounding. In your proposal, or where do you see price cost equalization, power cost equalization falling in? Is there a place for it in your proposal?
So no, but I think that the PCE fund should be non-sweepable. So how do you go about doing that? I don't know if that's a constitutional change or if that's a statute change. I don't know. I saw that the governor wants to wrap the PCE fund into the permanent fund, and then there's something about a payout, splitting the payout with the government, the PCE. I think it might make sense if we want to bring the PCE fund, and this is just an idea, as a sub-account of the permanent fund. That's fine, but it still remains at $1 billion, and it grows over time. And whatever the payout is whatever it is, 5% of $1 billion. It doesn't get absorbed into absorbed or part of the permanent fund. It's its own fund. It's just protected. It's protected so it can't be liquidated. I mean, I'm okay with that. I think that makes sense. But how you go about protecting it, there's all sorts of different mechanisms.
Can you speak to the procedural part, though, that, having this simple majority, then the 2/3 vote required, and then a 3/4 vote required for
So you talked about earlier about a constitutional convention. Well, you're right. Those things probably need to be addressed as well. And when we looked at it, I don't think there's any other state in the union that requires a 3/4 vote to access its savings accounts, i.e. the CBR. And of course, the earnings reserve account of the permanent fund only requires a majority vote. So therein lies the dichotomy. Would it make sense to make a change on the vote thresholds for some of these things? Yeah. Does it make sense to change the effective date? So you have, of course, the regular budget, and I think I wrote an op-ed on this, just takes a majority vote, which passed both bodies. Then the effective date all of a sudden has this 2/3 vote threshold. And I think we're seeing for the first time that that's sort of it can backfire on you. And I don't think the founders of the Constitution ever envisioned that. Would it make sense to have a 2/3 vote removed for a budget bill? Possibly. I'm not going to answer that. I think that needs to be discussed. I think that topic needs to be discussed if that's what you're asking. Yes, I think that we're all pretty surprised at this past June events. The reverse sweep and the CBR vote, yeah, they probably need to be discussed as well. Maybe the threshold of 3/4 is too high.
Yeah, it just seems that the margins there create the opportunity to monkey wrench a lot of things after the fact. And I can sense from the public that there's just this, bewilderment about why do we have it set up this way, where we're making progress and it seems like, budget amounts have sort of been announced, and then you go to the floor vote and things blow up.
Seems to be politics get in the way of common sense sometimes, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All right. Cheryl has another question about public engagement. Cheryl, you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Juanetta. And if my memory is correct, back to the 3/4 vote, I mean, that's required if you spend from the CBR. If you don't spend from the CBR, you don't need a 3/4 vote. And so just saying.
You need a 3/4 vote for the reverse sweep.
Well, okay, if you put everything into, that's because you have set up, not just you really, but all the designated funds. That's why you do the reverse sweep. If everything was in the unrestricted general fund, you wouldn't need to do a reverse sweep. So I didn't intend to get onto that bandwagon, but since it was mentioned. As you know, and we've had conversation with you and your staff during the session about the Budget Choices website that Commonwealth North and our study group put forward. And so out of about the 2,150 responses we've received, I think when Alaskans are faced with the choices of a full dividend versus income taxes or sales tax, they have some capacity to understand that you may not be able to have a full dividend or any dividend into the future until the state could afford it. So we found that, on balance, people get it. And then the poll that the House commissioned, I think, again, if you just ask, you want a dividend, hey, yeah, I want my dividend. But on the other hand, if you have to pay a tax to get it, they maybe aren't so enthusiastic. So the challenges for us on the sidelines, how can we effectively engage with elected ones to communicate that it isn't just the bumper sticker and who's yelling the loudest, that people who've thought about the trade-offs, that they get it, and it's okay to make a tough political decision.
So you're asking, Cheryl, how do we, as in Commonwealth North and the legislatures, communicate with the public?
Right, or who does what's your observation about who the legislature listens to, gets their information?
We talk about that all the time, and I think that it's less from the traditional media outlets and more towards talk radio, Twitter, bloggers, and folks that basically don't have an editorial board guiding them. And I think that's part of the problem. One of the things that you and I talked about earlier about your interactive website, that I think that, and I talked to Larry personally about this before, because I know that when he was deputy commissioner, he did a little bit of work on this. And I had a couple slides last fall when I was doing some presentations, that if you ask a person, do you want a full dividend, or what kind of dividend do you want? I want $1,000, I want $1,500. Okay, so this is number one. All right, this is the deficit that it will create. Number two, give us a level of what's your income. Are you making $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year? What is it? Well, based on that, this is how much taxes you're going to pay. And the tax foundation that the governor hired a year ago and the Department of Revenue both have their recommendations and their calculations on how much taxes they think that they could collect from the state. And I think that once folks plug in what their income is, we can have a program that says, okay, for your adjusted gross income, here's what you're going to pay in federal taxes, and here's what you're going to pay roughly in a state income tax, and here's what you're going to pay for a state sales tax. It's 4%, 2%, 1%, whatever it is. Here's what you're going to pay. And someone puts in their income, you figure out what they're going to pay in taxes, and I think they're going to have a big shocker. I don't really want to get that much. I don't pay that much in taxes and only receive this much in dividend. And I think when you start talking about taxes and put it in reality, I think people get sober really, really quick.
Yeah, and that's what we found with our Budget Choices website. I mean, they get it. And so, yeah, it's just how do we effectively, as civilians, then engage with the other legislators who, I mean, is it district by district in terms of the, constituents talking to their legislator? It's a campaign in order to get different voices heard. I mean, is that what we need to do?
I know how I get my news, and I know what kind of sources I listen to. I think it might behoove you to sit down with each of the different legislators and ask them, who is your kitchen cabinet and who do you listen to and why? And then you might be illuminated. I think that focus groups, asking people around town, different groups, how do you get your news? Ask individuals, how do you get your news? How do you make decisions based on what you're seeing around, based on what's happening in the community? Do you read the daily news? Do you read something else? Do you listen to talk radio? What is it? And I struggle with that, Cheryl. I don't have an answer for that. I know how I get my news, but I do not know how my fellow colleagues get their news. I actually have asked a few of them, but not all of them.
Okay, well, thanks. It's grassroots. It's going back to the basics. Yeah, maybe that's what it's going to take. Yeah, but thanks.
I think what's really important, though, just one last thing, is that elections matter. And last fall, we lost some colleagues that were pragmatic and common sense. And we have folks in the legislature now that don't see the state as a holistic, as a long-term. There's a lot of grab and go. If the electorate likes that, then this next election, we're going to lose more people and have more of this dividend or nothing else mentality. And we will just slowly start liquidating the earnings reserve account. Elections absolutely matter. And I scratch my head constantly of why I continue to go down in Juneau, because it is brutal.
Yeah, thanks. On all levels.
Okay, we do have a few more questions. This one just popped in. If the Aurora account gets established in fiscal year 22, could you envision having some sort of a repayment plan for sending the $6.7 billion back over time to the corpus?
I haven't even thought about that. That's a good idea. And I think those kind of ideas will come out when we start having hearings. We can't even repay the CBR right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, what is that? Is it
a lot?
Yeah, I was going to say 13, 17, something like that. Yeah. You know, one question, I mean, procedurally, I'm going to try and parse this out just a little bit, but, you know, we first started hearing discussions about the percent of market value concept during the Murkowski administration. And it took a long time for us to actually get to that point. And we have a couple of questions that sort of point to, this is something that I have found in my personal discussions, is that a lot of people don't understand that by still having the sort of the bifurcated fund as it exists now is somewhat contrary to the POMV concept, and that we don't have the true endowment. And these are, it's not that they're complicated, it's just that how do you, speaking to this earlier discussion about who listens to what, and how do you get the public's attention to focus in on these concepts and what they mean to them in their lives?
Well, first you have a total hissy fit on the floor, and then it gets broadcasted around the state 1,000 times, and they make T-shirts and hats out of you. That's how you get people's attention. Barring that, you repeat yourself again and again in a calm, orderly fashion, trying to use, I don't know, common sense. We think about this all the time because we understand that things take time and people are busy, like the summer. Who wants to be inside this weekend? Everyone wants to get outside. There's going to be a frenzy to go fishing and go camping and whatnot, and rightly so. That's what we're going to do. But I think that we're going to try to get people through these video newsletters. We're trying to talk to people through, you know, floor speeches, meeting one-on-one with different groups and so forth. You try to change up your, what do you call it? Your message. Commonwealth North is budgetary minded and very well versed on numbers. Not everyone is. You guys are a select group of people. So when we start talking about how the difference of an earnings reserve account and having it bifurcated, like you mentioned, and talking to other groups, you kind of have to just start from the beginning and build up slowly. And yeah, it takes time. If we can't get something, the people, if the legislature is not comfortable to vote on anything this spring, to have something in the fall of 22 for the election, then yeah, we got to wait 2 years. Mm-hmm. And in those 2 years, we're going to be fighting over the dividend again and again and again, unless there was another solution that occurred. And it's wearing, and we can't move forward.
Yeah. And I think that's really what the question it kind of is getting to, is that going back to the sort of the beginning of the discussions of POMV and sort of how protracted this discussion has been to try and get to a more durable solution that people feel they can trust is where, you know, we have the public's trust has perhaps either, well, I'll put it two ways. Perhaps the public trust maybe hasn't been eroded because people aren't paying that much attention for many people. But for those maybe that are paying attention, that there's maybe an erosion of trust because the process has taken so long and doesn't seem to be driving towards a solution.
I agree with you. Making the sausage is really hard. And, you know, if it would be great if we didn't have to negotiate with 59 other people, but we do. And 60 people have very different opinions on how things should go in the legislature. Very few do we ever get unanimous votes among all 60 of us, because it just takes negotiation and conversation, and we meet and we retreat and we come back together, and it just takes time. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating for us, for those of us that are there. I'm sure it's frustrating for the public that's watching, but fortunately or unfortunately, it's the nature of the beast. And it was set up that way, and it's been that way for, you know, since 1776. It kind of is what it is.
So there's a number of questions that kind of point to, what are you hearing from your colleagues? You know, there's some appreciation that's been expressed for the leadership that you and Senator Stedman have demonstrated in Senate Finance. And, you know, what is the temperature within the legislature for a durable solution?
Well, people want a solution. I see everyone wants a solution, but what that solution is remains to be seen. There's a lot of agreement and disagreement among my peers. I didn't drop this bill until May, so it really hasn't had a lot of time to sit and ferment. This is the second presentation that I've done on the Aurora account. Of course, the big conversations will start next month. I've had a few people very quietly say, we love it. Don't tell anybody. I'm kidding. But it's more like, wow, this is really interesting. We really like it. It's simple to understand. You know, some of the reasons that I've given earlier. There's some folks that say the dividend's not big enough. I'm okay with doing taxes and paying out a dividend. There's some folks that would like to take, more draws on the earnings reserve account each year, 5.5%, 6%. So there's people that have, they like the merits of it, but those conversations will continue.
Yeah. Well, just one final comment that's been posted by a couple of folks, that please know that your hissy fit was appreciated. There was an audience for it that appreciated it, and that, you know, sometimes you need to infuse the argument with a little emotion in order for the story to really capture people's minds and attention. And if there are hats and T-shirts perhaps being printed up, that maybe that's a more limited audience than you might expect, given the
I appreciate that. I think that that was a result of 5 months of anguish that had built up. Sure. And my mom and dad are watching this right now, and I really want to be with my parents right now and not in Juneau. And I think that's where it came from. Anyway.
Absolutely. And totally understandable. All right. Okay. Cheryl, I'm going to turn it back to you for any closing comments and just express our appreciation for the senator being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Juanetta. Thank you, Senator. We really do appreciate the work you're doing down in Juneau. And we're going to sift through the various options and see how we as Commonwealth North can be, have some kind of role in sifting through the choices that the legislature and the governor will face. So we're looking to have, for in terms of our going forward, we've extended an invitation to Matt Larkin to talk with us about the poll that he did for the House majority about the dividend and just to add to our understanding of what's on the minds of Alaskans. So any other suggestions to our study group about speakers that you'd like to have, we welcome hearing from them, and we'll stand by to see what's going to happen with the special session in terms of if it's August 2nd or if it's later or sooner or whatever. Not sooner, of course, but so we'll stand by to see there, and we'll just assess how we can help as civilians in encouraging the legislature to finally make a decision on this topic, or at least the opportunity for Alaskans to make a decision. So with that, I'll turn it back to Juanetta. Thank you once again, Senator, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Great. Well, thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Senator von Imhof. Just a reminder to everybody that we do have a program coming up in August 18, with Eric McGee with the Public Policy Institute of California, looking at the open primary issue. And we have changed the date for the Hickel and Egan Awards to November 4th, so please save that date on your calendar. And we will have some additional study group and forum dates coming up shortly. So thanks again to everybody for joining us today. Thanks to Ed and Kathy Rasmussen for being with us. It was good to see your face online. And again, have a great weekend, everybody. It looks like one for the record books, so enjoy. Take care.